In an attempt to prepare the way for a breakout by the American forces on the western flank of the Allied lodgement area in Normandy, General Montgomery had ordered the 3 armoured divisions of 8 Corps to attack over the Orne bridgehead on July the 18th, 1944. The 3 divisions, the 11th Armoured, the Guards Armoured, and the 7th Armoured, were to advance down a corridor of open, flat, arable land sandwiched between the Bois de Bavent ridge to the east and the factory area of Caen to the west. 2 further corps were to attack on either side and thus protect 8 Corps' flanks. Some 10 miles south of the start line lay the Bourguebus Ridge, the dominating feature of the ground south of Caen. The other main features were the villages of Cuverville, Giberville, Demouville, Le Mesnil-Fromentel, Le Prieur, Granteville, Cagny, Saulier, Four, Le Poirier, Fresneauville, Bras, Huberfolly, Bourguebus, La Hogue, and the 3 railway lines radiating from Caen. The 29th Armoured Brigade would lead the attack. As it swung to the west of Cagny, it would leave C Squadron of the Fife and Forfar Yeomanry to mask it. The remainder of the armoured regiments would race for the villages of Bras and Huberfolly. The Infantry Brigade, 159, was to take Cuberville and Demouville in a separate and slower operation supported by the 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Behind the 11th Armoured Division would come the Guards Armoured Division, who would take Cagny and then swing east to Vimont. The 7th Armoured Division would follow up the centre line in the rear. The plan was based on intelligence reports that estimated the prepared defences to be 3 miles in depth. In fact, the Germans expected a breakthrough in this sector, and their defences stretched the full 10 miles to the Bourguebus Ridge and beyond. However, the intelligence report did stress that some stiff opposition could be expected, so the Allied plan relied on an element of surprise, an annihilating air and artillery bombardment, and a swift follow-up. On the night of the 16th, 17th July, the 11th Armoured Division had moved from the west of Caen, and after a long, tiring and dusty journey, the units of the division leaguered just west of the Orne. 3rd Tanks were to lead the 11th Armoured Division, supported by G Company, 8th Battalion, the Rifle Brigade. David Stileman was at that time 20 years old and commanded number 11 Platoon.
At 1600 hours, the company was duly roused from its blissful slumbers. The company commander, Noel Bell, having given out formal orders, briefed the entire company as a whole. The riflemen were immensely impressed with the plan and the details of the bombing. Timing over target and the aeroplanes to be employed were enthusiastically written down on envelopes and the back of cigarette packets. Noel Bell, by doing this, made every member a shareholder in the operation from the word go. Rested and fully briefed, morale was sky high. As darkness fell on the 17th of July, we emerged from our peaceful orchard and started on our final trek to the concentration area. It was about 1 a.m. that we arrived into this sea of golden corn strewn with gliders from the D-Day landings. And the corn was so high, not only did it cover a Bren gun carrier, but the whole area was so congested that one had to ask the driver to move up a few feet in order to open the door of one's vehicle. Along with our friends of A Squadron, we only had 2 hours breather before making our way through the minefields. And as we looked back, we could see this ever-increasing armada of vehicles building up behind us. And we in G Company were delighted to be in the van of this operation because it looked too good a target for the Luftwaffe and the German artillery to pass by.
As 3rd Tanks moved up to the start line, A Squadron was in the lead under the command of Major Bill Close.
We had orders to form up on the start line in 3 waves. The first wave to consist of my A Squadron on the right with B Squadron on my left. The second wave to consist of RHQ, the recce troop, the carrier platoon, a troop of flails, and half a troop of adderers. And finally, the third wave to consist of the reserve squadron, the motor company, and H battery of 13th RHA in their priests. At 0530 hours, we were in position and awaiting the bombardment, which was to precede the attack. Wave after wave of bombers came over and dropped their bombs on the villages in front of us. It really did seem that nothing could live under the bombardment, but how wrong we were.
Lieutenant von Rosen, acting company commander of the 3rd Company of 503 Heavy Tank Battalion, was at Manneville.
Early in the morning, I was awakened by the familiar sound of aircraft engines. As I crept out from under my tank, I saw the first bomber waves approaching. From this moment on, our concentration area was subject to air bombardment, which lasted for 2.5 hours without interruption. We were located in the very center of the bombardment area. It was like hell, and I am still astonished that I ever survived it. I was unconscious for a while after a bomb had exploded just in front of my tank, almost burying me alive. I could see that another tank, about 30 meters away, had received a direct hit which had set it on fire instantly. A 3rd tank was turned upside down by the blast. And when I tell you that the tanks weighed 58 tons and were tossed aside like playing cards, you will see just what the hell we found ourselves in. It was next to impossible to see anything, as so much dust had been stirred up by the explosions. It was like being in a very thick fog. It was impossible to hear anything because of the unceasing crashing of explosions all around us. It was as if we were deaf. It was so nerve-shattering that we couldn't even think. All one could say to oneself was, will there never be an end to these explosions? After 2.5 hours, the air bombardment stopped suddenly, and the following silence was uncanny. As far as my company was concerned, 2 Tigers were completely neutralized. 2 others were so badly damaged that they couldn't be employed. All the tanks were completely covered with earth, and the gun sights had been thrown completely out of adjustment by the shock effect. 15 men of the company were dead. 2 soldiers had committed suicide during the bombardment. Another had to be sent to a mental hospital for observation. The psychological shock of these terrible experiences remained with us for a long time.
It had been the heaviest air bombardment in support of a ground attack ever mounted to that date, and it was hoped that any enemy in the path of the armor would have been effectively neutralized. It was to be followed by the artillery barrage behind which the 11th Armored Division would advance.
At 0745 hours, the artillery opened up. Tank crews had strict orders to be in their tanks, but these were not completely obeyed, and a few short-fall rounds falling among the leading tanks killed 3 of the regiment. We then set off as close behind the barrage as we could. We had been told to keep within 100 yards of the barrage. Soon we came across our first enemy. They were dazed and demoralized, and they came out from the cornfields attempting to surrender to the nearest tanks. By this time, the dust, smoke, and bomb craters were making control of the squadron more difficult and slowed our advance somewhat. However, I was able to open up the squadron to cover a frontage of about 500 yards. We saw a few enemy in the orchards to our front and in the bushes and trees on our right flank. And I gave instructions to my right-hand troops to brass up the forward edge of the orchard and the trees whilst on the move. When we came to the orchard area, I could see the German anti-tank gunners lying in their trenches or beside their guns, completely dazed and taking no interest in the proceedings. And so we came to the first railway line, and here we delayed for 10 to 15 minutes and tried to sort ourselves out. It didn't prove a tank obstacle, but it was a bit difficult for the wheeled vehicles of the regimental group.
Leaving third tanks crossing the first railway line, having met little resistance so far, let us look at the state of the German defences after the bombardment. We know the tanks had been badly damaged. Also in the main bombing area had been the assault gun battalion of Major Becker. The effect on them had been less severe. In spite of the heavy bombing of Caen, the battalion headquarters at the southern end was undamaged. Number 1 battery in Demouville was completely destroyed, but the battery commander remained in radio contact with Major Becker. Number 2 battery at Giberville was operational, and numbers 3, 4, and 5 were unharmed. Colonel Hans von Luck, the officer responsible for the defences in the path of the attack, had been granted 3 days' leave in Paris.
On the 18th of July, I left Paris very early in the morning because we could hardly move during daylight according to the air superiority. Coming down the hills east of Vimont to get my headquarters in Fresneville, it was absolutely quiet. It was very dusty and some single planes crossing the area. Coming into my headquarters, I asked the commanding officer whether I could have a little breakfast and whether he had any news. Much to my surprise, he informed me about what has happened some hours before. So I mounted with my parachute in my armored car and moved slowly from Fresneville towards Le Mesnil-Fremantle, crossing Caen very slowly, which was half destroyed, and coming to the western corner of Caen, I was absolutely afraid about what I saw. About 50 to 60 British tanks already crossed the main road Caen-Vimont, direction southwest, and some of them already the railway, and further tanks following from northeast. It was quite clear to me that the British had started to move through our lines and to try to break out. It was clearly impossible to reach Le Mesnil-Fremantle. Now it became absolutely clear to me that the 1st Battalion had been lost more or less by the air and artillery bombardment, and that a gap would be between the right flank of 192 at Colombelles and the remainder of my group on the right flank, and the danger of a further advance of the British attack southeastwards into our open flank. I tried to contact immediately the division commander and the 2 tank battalions, but unfortunately all our wireless were out of action at the moment. So I decided to drive back to my headquarters to organize a new defense line or counterattacks. driving slowly through Caen, I suddenly saw a single anti-aircraft battery of the Air Force with their guns in the air. I ran over to the CO and informed them about what I have seen. And I gave clear order to get immediately involved in this battle by fighting the British tanks. But I got a flat refusal telling me that he was under air command and had nothing to do with our battle on the ground. So I took my little pistol and asked him whether he would like to be killed immediately or get a high decoration. He decided for the latter. So he got a clear order to get in position with his battery in the northwest corner of Caen, not to deal with the advancing tanks, but with the following tanks coming from northeast. Coming back to my headquarters in Frindeville, I got my first small information about the situation. The CO of the 2nd Battalion informed me that he had to face some small attacks from the west and that he could build out from his block positions a screen facing west. So I gave him immediately order to build up such a screen from the north to about Mandeville. Then I came in contact with the division headquarters and informed the CO of the division about the situation. I told him that I was very afraid about the open flank direction Vimont and whether he could give me any reserves to close this gap. But he told me that that was not possible because both the battalions, the Recce Battalion and the Injured Battalion, were in position on the Burgobus Ridge to protect the artillery and anti-tank battalion positions behind the Burgobus Ridge. From this very moment on, the SP Battalion of Major Becker was the only unit with anti-tank to help us.
So this was how Colonel von Luck had disposed his forces, and these were the arcs of fire available to his anti-tank guns. It was still early in the day. 3rd tanks had crossed the 1st railway line and were swinging west of Le Mesnil-Fromentel. The following unit, the 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry, were moving to the east of the village. From their concealed positions, the assault gunners, trained to act on their own initiative within a general order, allowed the leading squadrons to pass. When C Squadron was in their sights, they opened up. In seconds, 12 out of 19 tanks were burning. Major General Roberts, commanding 11th Armoured Division, was moving up to control the battle from near Le Mesnil-Fromentel.
Now, perhaps you would like to consider what you would do as commanding officer when, having not heard from your rear squadron for a short time, you don't get them on the air, and you look back, and you find that they all seem to be knocked out. Some of them are burning, and some of them the crews are bailed out from. At any rate, they're non-operational. Now, a little bit after this had occurred, I had come forward in my TAC headquarters, and I had myself gone to Brigadier Harvey, who was in the outskirts of Le Mesnil-Fromentel there. A lot of mortar fire was coming down, so I got onto the back of his tank to inquire exactly what the situation was. And as I was there, I heard that it was the intention of the CO of the 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry to get his motor company on their feet and to attack Caen. Bearing in mind that I had particularly asked that we should not have to take Caen, and bearing in mind that our objectives were further over on the right flank, I did not want to start getting involved on the left flank, as the Guards were coming forward and they were going to take over Caen. So I told Brigadier Harvey to cancel that order. Now, you've already heard from Colonel von Luck how Caen was held
virtually by only those 4 Ack 88 guns. So how unfortunate was it that I had that order cancelled, because the motor company on its own could easily have cleared up the village in a very short time.
While C Squadron, the Fife and Forfar, were being engaged by the combined fire of the mutually supporting anti-tank guns in and to the east of Le Mesnil-Fromentel, third tanks were moving west of the village.
I stopped and looked through my glasses as we got close to the village, and I could see considerable activity among the walls and the houses, and it was pretty obvious that the village was fairly strongly occupied. I wanted to stop and use my squadron properly and put down a shoot, but I was being told by my CO in no uncertain terms to get on, get moving, and go to the west of the village. As I crossed over that fairly open country, there was some AP shot, 88 millimeter, coming from the areas of Cagny and Le Prieur, and it was quite extraordinary. They were overs and had no effect on my tanks. And as they came across the top of the corn, you could actually see them coming as they left a wake, rather like the wake of a torpedo. And you could, in fact, take evasive action. As we crossed over from Le Mesnil-Fromentel, we were then moving beyond the range of all but our own self-propelled tracked guns, the priests, which were with us. The whole of the third tanks passed to the west of Le Mesnil-Fromentel and motored on down towards Grantonville, which was the next village further on. Up to this point, we had had a fairly reasonable swan, except for the few casualties sustained by the left-hand squadron.
I should like to deal very briefly with the operations of 159 Infantry Brigade, who, you will recollect, had the task of taking the villages of Couverville and Demerville. I don't want to go into much detail. Suffice to say, the whole thing went very slowly. But it was at 10:30 that Couverville was cleared. And then, shortly afterwards, an order came from Corps that it was not to be unoccupied until handed over to a battalion from the 51st Highland Division, who were originally holding the front line in this bridgehead over the Orne, and they would come forward and take it over. There were delays in that. Demerville was not cleared until 15 hours. And by the time that was handed over, it was 1700 hours before they were released from that task and were available to me for other operations. At this fairly early stage in the operations, I was really quite happy with the situation, except that in the rear, where a little trouble had developed. The Fife and Forfar had lost a squadron, but their leading squadrons were pressing on between Solier and Four. 3 RTR had bypassed Le Mesnil-Fromentel and were crossing the Caen-Vimont railway. 10-30 were a bit tied up round Le Prieur, but with the guards coming up, I could extricate them as soon as they arrived. So, according to our information of the enemy's positions, we were about 3/4 of the way through the fixed defenses.
In fact, the 11th Armoured Division, with the Guards Armoured Division following closely behind, was only 1/4 of the way through, with the enemy redeploying skillfully as the changing situation demanded. Before the capture of Le Prieur, Major Becker had withdrawn his No. 5 battery to Le Poirier. Likewise, before the fall of Le Mesnil-Fromentel, he had moved No. 4 battery to southeast of Four. No. 2 battery at Giberville was moving back to Iberfolie, with No. 3 battery still in Grantonville. The anti-aircraft guns in Cagny were about to delay the guards, while the Fife and Forfar were moving only slowly forward after the shock of the ambush. Some Tiger and Mark IV tanks were now operational and moving to join Colonel von Luck at his headquarters in Fenouville. He had every reason to be satisfied with his position as third tanks were approaching the second railway line.
As I reached a little cornfield a few hundred yards from Grantonville, we were engaged by anti-tank guns from the forward edge of the village, and some of the tanks and my troops on the left, about 4 of them, went up in flames. I could also see several of the tanks further left in the left-hand squadron were also brewing. There was quite a lot of AP shot, which was coming from the bushes and trees in Glantonville, and also where the farm buildings are. Obviously, anti-tank guns in very well concealed positions. And within a matter of moments, there were 5 or 6 tanks brewing up. I told my 2 right-hand troops to tuck themselves down along the line of the embankment and get some HE fire on the forward edges of the village as quickly as possible. I had an OP with me right from the start, who was in a sawn-off honey, and I had given him instructions to stick close to me. I tucked myself in behind a small ridge, called him over, and told him, for Christ's sake, get a stonk down on as quickly as possible. All this time, I was being told in no uncertain manner by my CO to get over to the west side of the embankment. And I said, wait out until I can get a stomp down on the village. My 2 right-hand troops had, in the meantime, engaged several anti-tank guns and assault guns in this area. They claimed to have knocked out 2 or 3 anti-tank guns and at least 1 assault gun. I could see that the embankment was going to be rather a difficult problem, and I did not like the idea of going over the top, broadside on, within a few hundred yards of anti-tank guns. Also in this area, out in the cornfields, were lots of Nebelwerfers who were in the process of firing over our heads. We disposed of these by either running over them or blasting them with our small arm guns. I wanted to get my 2 right-hand troops to the western side of the embankment before I followed with the regimental group behind me. So I gave orders for them to move. Not a tank moved. Nothing happened at all. So I stood up in my tank, took off my beret, waved it 3 times round my head, and said over the air, conform to me. As I approached the embankment, my feelings were extremely mixed. I was not quite sure what to expect, and I was very apprehensive of whether there would be any mines. In the event, there weren't. And I shot through the hole rather like a rat up a drain pipe. I emerged on the other side to see this beautiful country looking perfectly peaceful. There was no sign of enemy movement whatsoever, and I was an extremely relieved squadron commander, I can assure you. My squadron came underneath fairly quickly after me. I went out towards the line of the hedgerows just short of the Cormel's factory area, and I halted there while the rest of my squadron came up. We tucked ourselves in along the hedgerow, and then I had a jolly good look through my glasses at Blair, Hubert Folly, and Yves. The rest of the regimental group then came under the embankment to join me.
With 3rd Tanks and G Company safely through the embankment and surveying an apparently peaceful stretch of country, it occurred to Colonel Silvertop, commanding 3rd Tanks, that it was necessary to establish if the village of Hubert-Folly, standing in the path of his next planned advance, was defended.
At this juncture, it so happened that my platoon headquarters half-track vehicle was some 3 yards distance from the gallant colonel. And fixing me with those steely eyes, he beckoned me over and said, boy, we must find out whether Hubert Folly is occupied. Jolly good idea, sir, I said, or something equally fatuous. How do you propose to do it? You're going to do it, came the reply. And as I swallowed, the ever-reassuring Noel Bell appeared at my elbow. The plan, like all good plans, was extremely simple. I was temporarily to command a section of the carrier platoon and drive hell for leather down the main street of the village. If we failed to appear, the chances are that the village was occupied. But if we emerged unscathed, the chances are the village was not occupied. Now, it so happened that Noel Bell produced a marvelous air photograph of the village of Hubert Folly and the surrounding area. And of course, this meant that I didn't have to fuss around with maps. And also at this moment, Bill Smith Osborne, who commanded H Battery of 13 RHA, offered his services. And he decided to put a heavy artillery concentration down on Hubert Folly as we approached to the village. And the last shell was to be a phosphorus one. And this was the signal for us to start on our journey down the village. And believe you me, once we'd started, there was no time for sauntering. And within seconds, we appeared at the other end of the village and reported back to Noel Bell and told him that we had met no resistance and had seen no sign of the enemy. But how wrong one can be, because as we discovered later, the village was groaning with enemy.
Reassured by the results of the recce, third tanks started to advance. Let us look at the concentration of fire that awaited them from Bras, Bourgebus and Hubert-Folly. The enemy in Hubert-Folly watched the left-hand squadron come along the line of the embankment and take up position just behind some hedgerows. Squadrons were covering about 1,000 yards at this time.
As we moved towards Bras and were within a few hundred yards short of the village, the whole of my squadron came under extremely heavy anti-tank gun fire from Hubert-Folly, Bras, and the direction of Ifs. And within a matter of moments, 4 or 5 of my squadron had been knocked out. I felt a hell of a crack on my tank. I hopped up and saw the remainder of the crew out. And I then saw that the left rear of the tank had been completely shot away from an AP shot from the direction of Bourgebus, which must be 2,500 yards away. I waved my tank crew back towards the embankment and then dashed over toward my headquarter tanks. One had been knocked out, but the other one was okay, and so I hopped into that one and resumed control of the squadron. I tucked myself in behind a short bushy hedge and took another troop of tanks with me. At this time, I could see the 2 left-hand squadrons were also heavily engaged by AP fire. We could see targets in both the villages. I had a troop sergeant with me in my little funk hole, and I got him to put down some AP fire on the anti-tank guns on the western edge of Bras. And he succeeded in knocking out 2 guns, and we also claimed a couple of assault guns as well. But there was considerable fire coming from Hubert-Folly. We, at that time, were broadside on, and it was extremely dangerous. Every time we tried to move forward, we lost more tanks. The left-hand squadron had moved out from their hedgerow, leaving 2 troops further forward, but these were quickly knocked out, and the remainder of the squadron had to withdraw slightly. It was pretty obvious that as soon as you got above the line of the embankment, you received casualties from the area of Bourgebus. At this time, the carrier platoon of G Company were doing absolutely sterling work, going up to the burning tanks, helping the wounded tank crews, putting them in their carriers and half-tracks, and bringing them back to the RAP down by the embankment. So, in a matter of an hour or so, this beautiful, peaceful scene had been transformed into an absolute battlefield.
Now the situation had changed considerably. You heard in some detail how the 3rd tanks got on west of the railway line, but meanwhile a good deal had been happening to the 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry and 23rd Hussars. Now the 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry had continued their advance, less 1 squadron, which of course had already been knocked out, through the area of 4, and 1 troop got up to the track between Borquebus and La Hogue. They were knocked out. And so were many other tanks knocked out, including the commanding officer's tank. In fact, communication with them was lost for some time. And then it was discovered that they had lost 40 tanks. Meanwhile, the 23rd Hussars had been moved forward from the area Manneville, Le Prieur, having been, of course, relieved by the Guards Armed Division, and they moved forward on the left of Granteville here, and also started to receive casualties. So the Armour Brigade was now held up by strong and accurate fire along the whole front. Now, at 12 o'clock, I met the Corps Commander, General O'Connor, and the Commander of 7th Armed Division, General Erskine, just behind Le Mesnil-Frementil. And I explained the situation to them, and I explained too that all these small villages, all inter-supporting, were held by strong anti-tank guns, either from tanks or from the ground. And no real advance could be achieved unless they were all dealt with or neutralized at the same time. I said that as my objectives were over to the right, I couldn't do much more until the gap between ourselves and the Guards on our left was taken over by the 7th Armed Division. General Erskine understood this, and he said that he would get his division forward as soon as possible and fill that gap and take over their line of advance. So I had great hopes that during the afternoon we would see the arrival of the 7th Armed Division and we would be able to continue our advance towards our objectives over on the right.
In fact, the afternoon wore on with no sign of the 7th Armoured Division, who appeared to have had difficulty crossing the minefields at the start line. The Guards Armoured Division continued to try to take Cagny and finally succeeded at about 1600 hours. 11th Armoured Division had little more success. During the afternoon, Granteville was attacked and eventually cleared, but all attempts to reach Four or Solier were defeated with heavy loss. Meanwhile, with third tanks unable to move forward, their motor company was subjected to heavy fire.
And wherever we moved, so these enemy shells followed us. And it wasn't made any easier because at this time we were tending to the gallant burnt crews from our own tanks who had suffered terribly throughout the day's fighting. But fortunately, at about this time, another section of the carrier platoon, commanded by a sergeant, moving up in the lee of the embankment, came upon a very gallant German who was controlling the artillery fire. And when he was dispatched, so mercifully the artillery fire ceased. And it was then that Noel Bell, with his clutter around him, was able to make his way back to Colonel David Silvertop and tell him that he thought that in this essentially armored battle, there was nothing much that the motor company could do. And so the colonel directed G Company to move the other side of the railway embankment.
In front of the halted British advance, Colonel von Luck's reorganized defenses were about to be further strengthened.
At about 1530 hours, I got a very encouraging message from the division headquarters that the 1st SS Panzer Division in reserve near Falaise would come up to the Bourg-Bus Ridge to take over the positions, to reinforce us and to counterattack the British advance. My order remained the same, to protect our right flank and to protect the flank from any penetrations to the southeast. In fact, some first elements of the 1st SS Panther Regiment as recce troops came onto the Bourg-Bus Ridge at about 200 hours in the afternoon, followed by infantry who got its positions on the Bourg-Bus Ridge during the night of 18th to 19th. During this night, our positions on the Bourg-Bus Ridge and on the right flank could be strengthened until the whole 1st SS Panzer Division got into its positions.
By evening, General Roberts was growing concerned about the enemy counterattacks, which had been increasing during the afternoon. So he moved 159 Infantry Brigade into defensive positions around Le Mesnil-Frémantel and 29th Armoured Brigade into positions round Granteville. The Northamptonshire Yeomanry remained protecting the right rear of 29th Armoured Brigade.
And so, at the end of the day, the 29th Armoured Brigade had lost 126 tanks, 26 in the 23rd Hussars, and the Fife and 4-fire and the 3rd tanks about 40 each. It was quite clear that we must reorganize, bring up what reinforcements there were, and that we needed a new corps plan for the following day.
On the following day, a new plan was made, the outline of which was, at 1600 hours, the 11th Armoured Division would attack Bras and subsequently Hubert-Folly from Bras. At 1700 hours, the 7th Armoured Division would attack Bourgebus and Four. At the same time, the Guards Armoured Division would attack Poirier and subsequently exploit to Fresnouville. All these attacks would be supported by artillery firing high explosive and smoke. By the morning of the 19th, the 1st SS Panzer Division had appeared in force on the ridge. Their Panthers took heavy toll on any tanks which ventured into the open ground within range. The plan for the 11th Armoured Division attack was that F and H companies would assault Bras, supported by the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. G Company would then assault Hubert-Folly, supported by 3rd Tanks.
In spite of repeated warnings, both from the divisional commander and myself, the Northamptonshire Yeomanry went too far to the west and were so heavily mauled that they could not support the attack on Bras. However, 3rd Tank switched roles and gave support to the attack on Bras. It was here that I lost my 2nd tank of the battle. On this occasion, both the driver and co-driver were killed. And once more, I changed tanks and entered Bras with the infantry. By 1900 hours, Bras was clear. 3rd Tanks had only 11 tanks left. From my point of view, on my squadron, I had lost 17 out of 19 tanks in the 2 days.
In spite of a further change of plan, in which once more the unfortunate Northamptonshire Yeomanry were unable to support an attack, G Company attacked Hubert-Folly, supported by the Fife and 4-fire Yeomanry. Within 1 hour, the village was in our hands.
The attack on Bras and Hubert-Folly was an excellent example of the cooperation of armour, motor battalion, infantry, artillery, coupled with the use of smoke. And by the end of the day, on the 19th, 11th Armoured Division were on the western end of the Bourgebus Ridge.
The Guards had captured Le Poirier, but had failed to take Fresnouville. 7th Armoured had taken Four, but had failed to capture Bourgebus. In fact, both Fresnouville and Bourgebus were to fall before Operation Goodwood ended in torrential rain on the 21st of July. The fact is that in 3.5 days, a British corps of 3 armoured divisions, 877 tanks in all, had advanced less than 10 miles at a total cost of 437 tanks. But they had gained the ridge and the field of battle was theirs. Before them, the ridge stretched on, but the German defences were shallow and the ground less suitable for defence in depth.
The 18th and 19th of July were very difficult and in a certain way frustrating days for us, but our defense could hold a greatly superior force from breaking out. The reasons were, on the British side, their tanks were outgunned by our anti-tank defense. They did not make use, the best use, of their air and artillery bombardment. And until the attacks on Bras and Hubert-Folly, they did not use their arms in a cooperating way. From our side, Our defense was in great depths, and with the exception of both the tank battalions and my own 1st Battalion, was able to withstand the effects of the bombardment. Major Becker's battalion, with very well-trained men and excellent equipment, and using orchards and villages in a very intelligent way, had a great effect in this battle.
First of all, I must congratulate Colonel von Luck on his handling of the defense. It was tenacious, remarkably flexible, and the recovery from the enormous bombing effort was quite remarkable. Now, as to ourselves, let us just look at the instructions issued by General Montgomery for this operation. We were given certain objectives. Well, we only got one of those. That was Bra Hubert Folly. Then we were to enlarge the existing bridgehead over the Orne. That was done to the extent of 10 miles from the start point, which gave a very fine base for further operations. Then we were to write down enemy armor and equipment. As far as we can discover, the enemy casualties were 75 tanks and SP guns and over 2,000 men. Then, and perhaps the most important of all, we were to attract to the Second Army front the bulk of the German armor so that the Americans would have an easier run from their breakout over to the west. That, I believe, was the most important objective of Goodwood. And I would ask you to look particularly at those heavy tank battalions which you have heard about from von Rosen. Perhaps all our hopes of Goodwood were not completely successful, but judged by the overall situation, it was by no means a failure.
Perhaps the last word should come from Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal von Kluge, in his dispatch to Hitler on the day Goodwood ended.
My discussion yesterday with the commanders in the Caen sector has afforded regrettable evidence that in face of the enemy's complete command of the air, there is no possibility of our finding a strategy which will counterbalance its truly annihilating effect, unless we give up the field of battle. In spite of our intense efforts, the moment has drawn near when this front, already so heavily strained, will break. And once the enemy is in open country, an orderly command will be hardly practicable in view of the insufficient mobility of our troops. I consider it my duty to bring these conclusions to your notice, my Führer, in good time.
On the 25th of July, the weather which had held up Operation Cobra since the 21st of July relented, and preceded by an air and artillery bombardment even greater than that at Goodwood, the American First Army attacked. By the 26th, they had advanced only 4,000 yards, but they were through the prepared defenses. By the 27th, the breakout had been achieved. The sacrifice at Goodwood had brought its reward, and the original plan conceived by General Montgomery was put into effect.